It was a cold, foggy evening in Victorian London when Sherlock Holmes, the world-renowned detective, sat in his cluttered office at 221B Baker Street. The thick mist outside the window made the evening seem even darker than usual. The gas lamps on the streets flickered weakly through the gloom, casting faint shadows on the cobblestone streets. Sherlock Holmes was deep in thought as he examined a set of complicated chess moves, his brow furrowed in concentration. Dr. Watson, his trusted companion and chronicler, sat across from him, scribbling in his notebook. The room was quiet, save for the faint rustling of paper and the occasional sound of Holmes tapping his fingers on his desk. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, breaking the silence. Without looking up, Holmes called, "Come in!" The door creaked open, and in walked a woman. She was elegantly dressed, though her eyes betrayed a deep sense of worry. Her face was pale, and she seemed distressed, clutching a letter in her gloved hands. "I am Lady Eleanor Ashford," she introduced herself, her voice trembling. "And I require your assistance, Mr. Holmes." Holmes looked up sharply, his piercing gaze taking in every detail of her appearance. He gestured to a chair, and she sat down, still clutching the letter tightly. "Please tell me what brings you here, Lady Ashford," Holmes said, his voice calm yet commanding, as if expecting something unusual. Lady Eleanor glanced at Dr. Watson, who sat silently in the corner, watching intently. She took a deep breath and began her tale. "My family has been the custodian of a priceless heirloom for generations. It is a diamond-encrusted necklace passed down through the Ashford family line. It has been kept in our private vault for years, and only my husband and I know the combination to the lock. However, last night when I went to check on it, the necklace was gone. The vault was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. I am certain that the thief must be someone within our household, but I cannot imagine who would betray us." She paused, her eyes searching Holmes's face for some sign of hope. "I need your help, Mr. Holmes. The heirloom must be recovered, and the thief must be brought to justice." Holmes took the letter from her hands, examining it carefully. Paper was thick and had an embossed seal, indicating it was from a reputable source. However, Holmes's keen eyes caught a small detail, an unusual ink blot on the top left corner of the letter. "You believe the thief to be someone within your household, Lady Ashford?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp as he scrutinized the letter. Lady Eleanor nodded. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Only a trusted servant or family member could have accessed the vault without raising suspicion." Holmes leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "I shall need to visit your residence at once, Lady Ashford. Watson, accompany me. We have a mystery to solve." The two detectives arrived at Ashford Manor shortly thereafter. The grand estate stood in the center of a lush garden, its stone walls towering above them. The heavy iron gates creaked as they pushed their way inside, and a cold draft met them at the door. The manor had an air of old money about it, refined but with a certain dark energy that lingered within its walls. Lady Eleanor led them to the vault room, a small, dimly lit chamber at the heart of the estate. The room was heavily secured, with an iron door and intricate locking mechanisms. Holmes observed every detail. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the door, no indication that someone had broken in. "The vault is here," Lady Eleanor said, her voice a mixture of anxiety and sorrow. She pointed to a large iron-bound chest sitting in the center of the room. The necklace was kept inside. Holmes examined the room with his usual meticulous attention to detail. He knelt by the vault door, carefully inspecting the lock. There were no signs of tampering, and the mechanism appeared to be in perfect working order. But Holmes's mind was already working, piecing together the puzzle. "Lady Ashford," Holmes began, his voice calm and steady. "How long has this vault been in use? And when was the last time anyone else besides you or your husband had access to it?" Lady Eleanor thought for a moment. "The vault has been in use for over a century. It was built by my great-grandfather to keep the family treasures safe. As for access, only my husband and I have the combination to the lock. We've had no visitors to the vault in weeks." Holmes stood up, his face thoughtful. He walked slowly around the room, his keen eyes scanning every inch of the space. "I believe," he said, turning to Lady Eleanor, "that the answer lies not in the vault, but in the people within your household." Dr. Watson stepped forward. "You believe the thief is someone inside the house, then?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly, Watson. And we shall begin by questioning everyone who has access to this vault." Holmes and Watson spent the next few hours speaking to the household staff and family members. The butler, the maid, the cook, and the gardener, all of them denied any involvement in the theft, but Holmes's sharp instincts told him that the thief was close. As the evening wore on, Holmes became more and more convinced that the key to the mystery lay with one of the household members. There was something in the way they all acted, something that didn't quite add up. Finally, Holmes decided to inspect the vault again, hoping to find a clue he had missed earlier. As Holmes and Watson stood in the vault room, the shadows from the flickering gas lamps cast an eerie glow on the stone walls. Holmes was deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he examined every corner of the vault again, hoping to find a clue he might have missed. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice filled with curiosity, "why are you so certain the thief is someone within the house? Seems like an impossible mystery." Holmes stood still for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. "My dear Watson," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "the absence of any forced entry suggests that whoever took the heirloom was someone with knowledge of the vault's workings. This person had to have access either to the vault or to the key. And more importantly, they must have known the exact location of the necklace." Holmes moved to the vault's locked door again, running his fingers over the intricate lock mechanism. The fact that the lock shows no signs of tampering means that the thief either had the combination or somehow gained access to the room without the need for force. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after. Dr. Watson nodded, though he still seemed perplexed. But what about the servants? Surely someone might have slipped up. Holmes smiled slightly, the glint of understanding in his eyes. "Exactly, Watson. That's why I'm not entirely convinced. We're dealing with a well-placed thief, someone who has made no obvious mistake." Suddenly, Holmes's gaze flickered toward the windowsill, and he walked over to inspect it carefully. The room had been thoroughly searched, but something caught his eye. A thin trace of dust on the edge of the sill appeared disturbed, as though it had been touched recently. "Ah, what have we here?" Holmes muttered under his breath. He ran his fingers along the windowsill, revealing a single tiny footprint in the dust, an inconspicuous sign that someone had been standing there recently. The print was small and delicate, and although it seemed unimportant at first glance, Holmes recognized the significance immediately. "This is no ordinary clue," Holmes said, turning to Watson. "The thief used the window to gain access." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You mean to say someone slipped through the window without alerting anyone?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. Whoever did this was cautious, and they had to be quick. They knew the window would provide a hidden route into the vault room, away from the watchful eyes of the staff." The two detectives set off again, but this time their focus shifted. Holmes was now certain that the thief had used the window as a means of entering the vault room without being noticed. The footprints were just the beginning, and he knew that the culprit must have left more traces. Holmes and Watson went on to speak to each of the household staff members once more, but now their questions were more direct. They spoke with the butler, the maid, the cook, and the gardener, carefully observing each of their reactions. It was the maid, Margaret, who gave the most telling response. When asked if she had seen anything unusual near the vault, her face flushed briefly and her hands fidgeted nervously. Holmes's keen eyes noticed the subtle change in her demeanor, but he didn't jump to conclusions immediately. Instead, he continued the conversation with his usual calm demeanor. "I'm afraid I haven't seen anything unusual, Mr. Holmes," Margaret said, her voice slightly shaky. "I've been busy with my duties, as always." Holmes gave her a long look before asking, "And what about the window? Have you seen anyone near it recently?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "No, Mr. Holmes. I don't recall seeing anyone near the window, but I don't often go into that room." Holmes's instincts told him there was something more. He turned to Watson, who seemed to be catching on. "We shall need to take a closer look at the window, Watson," Holmes said, his tone now decisive. "I believe we're on the right track." Returning to the vault room, Holmes and Watson began their search anew. Holmes focused on the window once again, inspecting it carefully from every angle. It was a narrow, high window positioned just above eye level. Someone would need to be agile and cautious to use it as a point of entry. Holmes examined the frame and noticed faint traces of dried mud on the edges, suggesting that someone had recently climbed through. The marks were subtle, but they were enough to confirm his suspicion that someone had accessed the room from outside. Dr. Watson leaned closer, inspecting the window frame. "It seems the thief didn't plan on leaving a trail." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "but they were in too much of a hurry. Whoever it was didn't think to clean up all the evidence. We are getting closer to uncovering the truth." Holmes stood tall, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle. Margaret, the maid, is certainly hiding something. Her nervousness was telling. But why would she betray her employers? Holmes called the family together once again, this time with an air of finality. He knew that he was about to reveal the truth, and he could feel the tension building in the room. The staff gathered in the sitting room, along with Lady Eleanor Ashford and her husband, Lord Ashford. The two detectives stood in front of them, ready to present their findings. "After much consideration," Holmes began, his voice steady, "I have uncovered the identity of the thief. It is someone who knew the layout of this house intimately and had access to the vault room without raising suspicion." He paused, allowing the room to hang in suspense. "It was Margaret, the maid." Holmes continued, his voice unwavering. "She is the one who took the heirloom." Lady Eleanor gasped, her face pale with shock. "But how could that be? Margaret has been with us for years. I never suspected her." Holmes explained how the tiny footprint on the windowsill had led him to suspect someone had used the window to access the vault room. He then detailed the traces of mud found on the window frame, evidence that pointed directly to Margaret. Margaret was clever enough to use the window to avoid detection, but she left behind evidence that led us straight to her, Holmes concluded. "She took the heirloom, but she underestimated my ability to spot the smallest details." Margaret was brought forward, her face pale and nervous as she stood before Holmes. She had no choice but to confess. In a trembling voice, she admitted her guilt. I was desperate," she whispered. "I needed money, and the necklace was worth a fortune. I never meant for anyone to find out." Lady Eleanor and Lord Ashford were devastated by the betrayal but relieved that the heirloom was recovered. Holmes had once again solved a complex case, using his brilliant deduction skills and unyielding attention to detail. As Holmes and Watson left Ashford Manor, the cold night air felt refreshing. Watson couldn't help but admire Holmes's skill. "Another case solved, Holmes," Watson said with a smile. "But I have to admit, I'm still amazed by how you found the thief so quickly." Holmes turned to Watson with a sly grin. "Ah, Watson, it's all in the details. As always, the truth is hidden in plain sight."